Okay, thanks very much. So today I'm going to be talking about the UK-SSPS project, funded under the UK Climate Resilience Programme, led by Cambridge Econometrics, with engagement from some of our partner organisations listed here. Cambridge Econometrics in the lead, and I'm the principal investigator. We have also engagement and work from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, the University of Edinburgh and the University of Exeter. Now, the principal motivation for this piece of work is that we know in the IPCC framework there are an overlay of concentration pathways of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, and shared socioeconomic pathways. These are produced globally, but while we have a UK set of concentration pathways, the UK-CP18 database, we do not at the moment have a spatially detailed set of SSPs for the UK. And that's what that sort of gap is what this project is seeking to address. It's not the first piece of work done in this area, although it's the first of this kind of scale. So we're building in particular on two existing projects. As part of the CCRA3, there was a project for the CCC that was delivered by Cambridge Econometrics, which was delivering fairly rough and ready socioeconomic scenarios to feed into that CCRA3 evidence base, and led by UKCH, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. There was the UK-SCAPE project, which looked at the UK level to provide these SSPs. The project started in January 2020, in those heady days before we all knew quite what was going to be happening through 2020 and the extent of lockdown, and is going to be completed by May this year, so just in 4 or 5 months' time. Now, just take a step back and talk about the roles of scenarios, and specifically where the SSPs fit into that. I think there's often a lot of confusion about, in particular, the difference between scenarios and forecasts. Now, scenarios here, and scenarios as they're used in this IPCC type framework, are supposed to be ways of looking at possible futures, and acknowledging that there are huge uncertainties in any kind of prediction of the future. So we're not seeking here to say this is what we think the UK economy is going to look like in 2040, in 2070, in 2100, but to say these are different illustrative paths which the UK economy could follow, and these are some of the key implications of those different pathways. So they're, as it says here, they're exploring what might happen and not what will happen, or indeed what we might want to happen. Certainly, if anyone with a knowledge of the SSPs, most of us on this call would much more favour an SSP1 type world, sustainability type world, than an SSP5 world where we're all locked into fossil fuel consumption. But we explore all of them to understand, in a sense, the possibility space. And fundamentally, we know that climate change, at whatever level we manage to sort of limit it to, will interact with our existing system, so with the socioeconomic system, with the political system, in a number of ways, and in a number of sort of non-linear ways, which is to say that if we're at 1 degree of climate change now, 2 degrees is not necessarily just twice whatever happens at 1.5 degrees. Or vice versa. There are these are non-linear systems. There are a lot of feedback loops, and so for that reason, there is a large degree of uncertainty and a large sort of possibility space to be explored in the SSPs. But the socioeconomic factors that we explore in the SSPs also have a large influence on climate risks. Not just on the underlying level of emissions, which is certainly the case when you look at this at the global level, but also, how many people there are living in the country, where they live in the country, their wealth, and therefore their sort of ability to adapt, for example, to climate change. So we can see there's a lot of links between the sort of socioeconomic system and the risks and impacts of climate change. So this piece of analysis is aiming to feed into that. And in particular, the development of the spatially detailed SSPs that we're doing here will feed into the fourth CCRA and the work that starts on that. So where are we trying to get to? The ultimate aim is to deliver narratives for the 5 SSPs for the UK and for the constituent countries. So that's for England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, that have been developed based upon and in a way that is internally consistent with the global SSPs. So that means, in many cases, taking those global SSPs as our kind of overarching narrative and thinking about and outlining what is the UK's role within that global narrative and what will be happening within the UK that would be consistent with those global patterns. In addition to those qualitative narratives, we'll be developing semi-quantitative trends. I'll give you an example of these a little bit later. We'll be doing quite a lot of quantification, so coming up with a database of specific indicators to give some sort of hard and fast numbers which actually underpin these scenarios. And we'll be illustrating all of this through what we call causal loop diagrams. They're essentially kind of systems diagrams which seek to provide insight into the key drivers of the different SSPs. So they're not kind of formal modeling frameworks, but instead they are ways of understanding how certain outcomes that we foresee in these narratives, in these semi-quantitative and quantitative data that's provided, how they come about and what the drivers are and what is driving what in each of those kind of different socioeconomic systems that we see. The project consists of 3 main activities. A sort of scoping stage. The scoping stage was about understanding what was in the literature, but most importantly, I think, was about stakeholder engagement, about understanding what a lot of people on this call, the UK climate resilience research community wanted and needed from this piece of work. What were the kinds of indicators? What was the level of spatial coverage? These kinds of insights were provided in activity 1. Activity 2 focused on the qualitative and the semi-quantitative aspects, so the SSP narratives and the semi-quantitative trends. Again, I'll show examples of these outputs very shortly. And activity 3 on the quantification, so the hard numbers of production of the database, and ultimately provision of the open source tools, the ways that essentially the research community will be able to engage with and use the outputs of the project. And so now I'm mostly going to focus on what some of these outputs look like, giving you some draft outputs. As I said, we're working on, continuing to work on this project for another 5 months. So anything you see here is very much, draft in nature, and that we expect continued evolution and change in some of these outputs as we go. But just to give you a feel for that, and hopefully to sort of pique your interest going forwards. So the first thing, the narratives for each of the SSPs. Here's an example, hopefully in far too small font that you can't read, narrative for SSP 5. So the full narratives are, as you can see here, sort of around 5 pages. And what we're seeking to do in these is to describe the time-dependent socioeconomic developments in each of the SSPs. This is split into 3 time periods. So we have from present day to 2040, 2040 to 2070, and 2070 to 2100. And for each, as you can probably see in the sort of the little red headings, we have a paragraph highlighting the key differences between the regions, or using the countries and the regions within those nations to illustrate some of the sort of the key trends that are seen and how they play out across each of the 5 SSPs. Also under the activity 2, we produced these first versions of the systems diagrams. Now this is what a sort of a whole system diagram looks like, and if I move on, you'll see a slightly zoomed in version. So these were developed during a workshop that we held for activity 2. It was originally supposed to be 2 days sort of intensive face-to-face work. Due to COVID restrictions, that ended up being I think it was 5 sessions split over 4 days. Quite a lot of intensive work gone into these from a wide range of stakeholders to think through in detail each of the SSPs, and to think through how we expect as a group the economic system to develop in each of the SSPs, and what the key linkages and drivers were in each of those systems, essentially. So we have here a set of drivers, if you like, the boxes that are the key sort of thematic areas, and then the arrows show how those are linked, and the text commentary that you can see here. In this specific SSP, what is the particular dynamic that is taking us or is leading, for example, to pick the most obvious prominent one here, the energy system to impact upon economic development. So really to put some flesh on the bones, the workshop and a lot of this work done in those groups was done before the narrative. So this was about informing the narratives, but also informing the causal loop diagrams that were later developed, allowing us to think through and to set out very clearly what some of these linkages look like, and then to start drawing out comparisons and differences between the different scenarios. Also in activity 2, we developed a series of semi-quantitative trends, and there's a nice example of this on the next slide. So don't worry too much about trying to crane yourself to look at the little table there. But this is just to illustrate kind of what was done. We identified for each of the key indicators across each of the SSPs and across each of our 3 time slices, how we expected these drivers to change in that SSP compared to sort of current day, and taking into account what's happened in the past, particularly in most cases sort of the recent past. So essentially to set out on that basis, okay, from the current position, do we expect this particular indicator to increase in a sense, sort of increase a bit, a reasonable amount, or a lot? That's the 1, 2, 3 scale we have here on the plus, on the minus side. So on a 1 to 7 sort of scale, to understand then the evolution. And of course, some things are linear in the sense that, you start off going a little bit, and then by 2040 you're a little bit ahead. By 2070 you're quite substantially ahead, and by 2100 you're a long way ahead. But in other cases, we got some very interesting dynamics that came out of those discussions, even cases where in the short term, in the first sort of period, the first time period, you might expect an increase, say in population in SSP3, but actually by 2070, due to some of the other dynamics, by 2100 we expect decreases in population. So able to explore some quite interesting narratives, some quite interesting dynamics through this kind of framework. And then these were illustrated on these kind of line charts, and sort of agreed between the groups that were looking at each of the SSPs exactly what these time profiles should look like. So yeah, you can hopefully see here a bit more clearly what those evolutions look like, where on the on the axis here, we've got that kind of 1 to 7 scale. And then activity 3, and the bit that we're now sort of chiefly engaged in, is the quantification of indicators. And there's a range of different approaches being taken here to this quantification. We're using a lot of existing sort of process-based and statistical models. So this is particularly for things like downscaling of projections, where we have, for example, taken projections at the UK level from the EASA database of outputs provided by the different integrated assessment models. And we're using our models to then allocate, if you like, those UK level results across the more detailed spatial level. We're also using what I've described here as thematic models. These are models that are designed and used already by the sort of UK research community to explore some of these different issues. So, for example, UK Crafty looking at land use, FTT Power, which is a technology diffusion model that looks at the evolution of the power sector, and ECME, which is Cambridge Econometrics macroeconomic model. So a range of these different models to explore how some of these areas are interlinked, and to use those to explore these different SSP futures based on a specific set of inputs to the models. We have in other areas, we've taken the semi-quantitative trends and we've used those to sort of turn them into sort of hard numbers, if you like, through applying those semi-quantitative trends to historical baselines. So taking the historical data, applying this scale, sort of agreeing what our 1 to 7 scale means in terms of specific growth rates, and using that to quantify some of those series. And as I said, using existing results such as the EASA database and models to downscale. And in some cases, we've downscaled to in some cases, the indicators themselves are still national, because that sort of makes the most sense for that particular indicator. For example, our technology indicators are at the national level, but in other cases, going down to much finer levels, down to 1 square kilometre, for example, for population. And obviously, we've been doing consistency checks and testing, and that's kind of where we are at the moment on the project. Just to show you what some of these quantifications look like. So this is our household income per capita maps. This is just for 3 of the SSPs. So the 4 maps sort of on the left hand side are SSP1, the 4 in the middle are SSP3, and the 4 on the right SSP5. And it's over these different time slices. So in each set of 4, the top left is the 2020, it's the kind of current day, and then top right is 2040. Bottom left is 2070, bottom right is 2100. So you can see in the different SSPs, these indicators can evolve in very different ways from the current situation. And in quite a lot of these, probably partly because we're not showing SSP2, which I guess is the closest to kind of business as usual. In each of these SSPs, you see very different patterns emerging, even by 2040, compared to the current situation. So again, this is allowing us to explore the sort of the possibility space to understand the uncertainties. And another example here, in terms of urban land cover change, just for a couple of the SSPs to show how these develop and to show how these link into the narratives. Right, so the text in italics here is part of those narratives that have been established for each of the SSPs. I'm using that to inform the development of the quantitative indicators. And I said earlier that each of these indicators, so where we're doing the final quantification, is then being integrated into this kind of causal loop diagram framework. And I just like to finish to show you an example of what that looks like, and therefore what you can sort of expect to see when you come to look at this data once we've finished the work. So hopefully you can now see my browser on the screen. This is the same kind of causal loop diagram that I showed an example of earlier that came out of activity 2, but here kind of operationalized into something a bit more interactive. for users. And this is obviously a very, very early draft of what it's going to look like. But we'd imagine this being embedded into a web page to allow the user to understand. So you can see the key drivers within this framework, and between each SSPs, these drivers are the same. What differs really is the nature of the links between them. So, for example, let's hope this works. So here's a difference between SSP2 and SSP3. So you can see just there, we have the same sort of blocks, building blocks within the scenario, but what differs very much is the links between them, and essentially the way those links operate, reflecting again what came out of that activity 2 analysis. And under each of these, you can look at the data that's embedded within each of these sort of sets of each of these themes, if you like, these sets of drivers. So each of the indicators that we're producing, you'll be able to access the data, you'll be able to access the maps where those maps have been produced, to allow you to engage with and understand, if you like, the thinking that has underpinned the development of the SSPs, as well as access the quantitative data. So the idea here is to not just give you a big database, a big spreadsheet full of numbers and say, off you go, good luck, but to allow you to think about, or you to understand what's driven our thinking, what's driven the development of the narratives of the individual SSPs, and to think about, and to therefore to think about how that links to your own research, how that links into where we haven't maybe quantified an indicator or something that affects your work. Well, okay, what does the scenario suggest might be happening in that particular indicator, or what can I gather from the narratives, from the semi-quantitative trends, from this causal loop diagrams? What can I kind of infer about those particular indicators?